The flatbed was already winching my car off my own driveway when I came out in my robe with a coffee gone cold in my hands. It was the first week of March, the kind of morning that hasn't decided yet whether it belongs to winter or spring, and the light was thin and gray over the rooftops of Cedar Hollow. My sedan, a 9-year-old thing with a dent in the back panel I had never bothered to fix, hung at an angle off the back of the truck, its front tires lifted clear of the concrete I had paid to pour, the concrete that sat, every square inch of it, inside the boundary of land my grandfather had left me. A man named Dale Ostrander stood at the end of the driveway with a clipboard held against his chest like a hymnal. He was the president of our homeowners association, 58 years old, silver at the temples, the kind of man who ironed his polo shirts for a Saturday. Beside him stood Lonnie Frick, the property manager the board paid to do the parts Dale found distasteful to do himself. Neither of them looked uncomfortable. That was the thing I noticed first, even before I noticed my car. They were not uncomfortable at all. "Good morning, Ms. Donnelly," Dale said. I did not answer. I stood on my own front step and watched the operator tighten a strap, and I felt something in me go very still and very quiet. There is a strange thing that happens when you have been treated as a problem for long enough. You stop arguing. You start watching. You begin to pay attention the way a person pays attention to weather, because you have learned that the storm does not care whether you find it fair. The tow operator was a young man in a reflective vest, and he would not look at me. That is how I knew, more than anything Dale said, that what was happening was wrong. The operator knew it. He worked the controls and kept his eyes on the strap and on the winch and on the small, safe square of his own hands, anywhere but on the woman in the robe, standing on her own step while they took her car. A couple of my neighbors had come out onto their porches in the cold to watch, holding their own coffees, and they did not look at me either. A street learns very quickly who it is safe to be seen with, and I had been marked unsafe for 2 years. "There's a citation on file," Dale went on, when it became clear I was not going to fill the silence for him. "Non-compliant parking. We sent 3 notices." "It's parked in my driveway," I said. "It's parked in a manner inconsistent with the community standards your deed obligates you to follow." He said the word deed the way some people say a word in a language they don't speak, confident of the sound and careless of the meaning. "People like you lower the whole street's value, Ms. Donnelly. It isn't personal, it's arithmetic." I have thought about that sentence many times since. It isn't personal, it's arithmetic. He believed it the way you believe the floor will hold your weight. He had done the math on me a long time ago, and he had never once gone back to check his figures. He walked to his car, a clean German sedan parked at the curb, and he set a folded document on the hood and slid it toward me across the paint. "While you're here," he said, "the board recorded this Friday. I'd recommend you read it carefully and talk to whoever you talk to." I picked it up. It was a notice of a lien against my property, against Lot 17, in the amount of $14,000. I read it standing there in my robe with the cold cup in one hand. It was itemized. That is the part I keep coming back to. Somebody had sat at a desk and itemized it. There was a charge for a mailbox that an inspection had found to be set 1/2 inch lower than the approved specification. There were charges, monthly and compounding, for a fence I had stained the wrong shade of brown, a brown the board's architectural committee had ruled was not on the approved palette. And near the bottom, in a font no larger than the rest, there was a line item for the color of my front door. They had fined me for the color of my own front door, and the fine had a number, and the number had interest, and the interest had brought the whole thing to $14,000 and a truck in my driveway. "Is there a problem?" Dale asked, because I had been quiet too long for his comfort. "No," I said. I folded the lien once and put it in the pocket of my robe. No problem. I think he wanted more. I think he had come for a scene, the way men like Dale come for scenes so they can describe them later to the board as evidence of the kind of person they are dealing with. I did not give him one. I looked past him, down the street, to where the community clubhouse sat with its low roofline and its tidy landscaping, and to the pool behind it, drained for winter and covered with a gray tarp, ringed by a black aluminum fence the board was very proud of. I looked at that pool for a long moment. I did not know yet exactly what I was looking at, but some part of me, the part that had spent 15 years reading land for a living, had begun to feel the shape of a question I had never thought to ask about my own street. The flatbed pulled away with my car. I watched it turn the corner by the clubhouse and disappear, and Dale Ostrander wished me a good day, and Lonnie Frick said nothing at all, and I went back inside and set the cold coffee in the sink and laid the folded lien flat on my kitchen table. Then I went to work, because that is what you do. You go to work. I waited at the bus stop at the entrance to the subdivision under the carved wooden sign that says Cedar Hollow, a community of distinction, and a few of the cars that passed slowed just enough for the people inside to see me standing there without my car, and then sped up again. I want you to understand that I was not crying. I was not even, in that moment, angry. I was doing the thing I do best, which is to grow very quiet and very attentive, and to begin, underneath the quiet, to read. Because on the whole ride in, on the bus I had to take because they had my car, I kept seeing the pool behind its fence, sitting where it had always sat, and I kept hearing my grandfather's voice from a long time ago telling me something I had filed away as a story. They poured that pool in the rain, he had said, and never reshot a thing. At the time, it had been an old man grumbling. By the time the bus reached my stop downtown, it had become a question, and I am a person who, when handed a question about land, cannot put it down until I have read the answer. I should tell you what I do, because it matters to everything that came after. I work in the county land records office. I have worked there for 15 years. My job, when you boil away the titles and the software, is to know where things end. People come to my counter or they call my line, and they are confused or frightened or angry about a boundary. And I find the paper that tells the truth and I show it to them. A title agent who can't reconcile two descriptions. A farmer whose neighbor moved a fence. A young couple who just learned that the shed they bought sits 3 feet onto somebody else's parcel. I am the person who reads the plats and the deeds and the survey maps and says calmly, here is where your land actually is. I am good at it. I say that not as a boast, but as a fact, the way you would say someone is good at the piano. I am good at it because I was taught young and because the work suits a certain quietness in me. I am not a loud person. I do not win rooms. For most of my life, that quietness has been read by people like Dale Ostrander as a kind of weakness, a softness, an absence of teeth. They mistake the fact that I do not argue for the fact that I cannot. That very afternoon, the afternoon of the day they towed my car, a title agent came to my counter nearly in tears. She had a closing in 2 days and 2 legal descriptions that would not reconcile, and the buyers were frightened and the sellers were angry, and she did not know how to tell either of them. I pulled the chain of deeds back 40 years, and I found the place where, in 1984, someone had transposed 2 numbers in a bearing, and I showed her the corrected description, and the fear went out of her face. She thanked me 4 times. That is the work. All day long, I stand at the edge of other people's panic, and I hand them the one piece of paper that tells them the truth, and they walk out steadier than they walked in. I had simply never once turned that whole patient skill on the ground under my own feet. That evening, I came home from work, still without my car, and I made dinner, and I did the dishes, and then I sat down at the kitchen table where the lien still lay. Beside it, I set a pencil. It was an old surveyor's pencil, flat-sided so it won't roll off a slope, the lead worn down to a stub. It had been my grandfather's. I kept it in a drawer, and I am not a sentimental woman about objects, but I had taken it out that night without quite deciding to. My grandfather, August Donnelly, used to tell me that a property line is just a promise that somebody wrote down. The whole trick, he said, is finding out who wrote it down first. I had built a career on that sentence without ever noticing that I had never once turned the question on my own street. I spent my days telling strangers where their land ended. I had simply never asked where mine began. That night, I called Teresa Vogel, a real estate attorney whose name I knew from work, the way you know the names of the competent people in a small field. I told her about the lien. I read her the line item for the door. She was quiet for a second, and then she said, Maeve, I want you to take this seriously. A recorded lien is a real cloud on your title. It doesn't matter how stupid the underlying fines are. If it sits there, it can foul a sale, a refinance, an estate. Don't ignore it. I won't, I said. And don't sign anything, she said. Whatever they put in front of you, whatever they offer, don't sign anything until I've read it. People in your position make their worst mistakes trying to make the unpleasantness stop. I told her I understood. I did understand. I have watched it happen across my counter 100 times. A person so desperate to end a fight that they sign away the very ground they're standing on. After she hung up, I sat with the lien and the pencil side by side on the table, 2 halves of a sentence that had not yet found each other. The house was quiet. The street outside was quiet. Cedar Hollow is always quiet. That is the whole product the board is selling, a quiet that costs $410 a quarter in dues, and apparently $14,000 in fines if your door is the wrong color. I left the lien and the pencil on the table overnight. I'm not sure why. I think I already knew that I was going to do something, and I think I wanted to sleep one more night before I knew what it was. To understand the land, you have to understand my grandfather, and to understand him, you have to go back before the subdivision existed at all. In 1971, August Donnelly bought roughly 6 acres of open farmland at the edge of a town that had not yet decided to grow in that direction. It was just a field then, with a creek along the low edge and a stand of cedars that gave the place the name it would later sell. He built a small house, and he kept bees, and he grew more than he could eat, and when my mother had me, he became the fixed point my childhood rotated around. He taught me to read land the way other grandfathers teach fishing. We walked the fence line together, him in his canvas jacket with that flat pencil behind his ear, and he showed me the survey pins sunk in the dirt at the corners, little iron rods with caps, and he showed me how they matched the marks on the old plat he kept rolled in a tube in the closet. "Folks will tell you where you belong, Mavie," he told me once, crouched down with his thumb on a pin. "The paper tells you where you are. Those are not the same thing, and you want to learn the difference early. Learn the paper." In 1997, a developer came through and platted the whole area into the subdivision that became Cedar Hollow. My grandfather sold them most of his acreage. He was old by then, and the money was real, and the fields were going to become houses with or without him. But he carved out and kept the homestead lot, the piece with his small house and the cedars and the corner where his oldest survey pin had sat since before I was born. On the new plat, that piece became Lot 17. The developer built fast. In a single wet summer in 1998, they put up the clubhouse and poured the pool and laid the parking lot that served them. And my grandfather, who watched it all from his porch, told me they never sent a man back out to check the corners. "They poured that pool in the rain," he said, "and they never reshot a thing." Surveyor's crew came through once in a hurry and left. I was a teenager. I filed it away as one of his stories, the way you file away an old man's complaints about how nobody does things properly anymore. He died in the autumn of 2003 when I was 18, and I was the one who sat with him at the end. And the last clear thing he said to me that I am sure he meant for me was, "You hold on to the corner lot, Mavie. That one's yours. The paper's in the desk." I thought he was wandering. He was not wandering. He had spent his last good months making sure the paper would say what he wanted it to say, because he knew, the way he knew weather, that one day somebody would try to tell me I did not belong on my own ground, and he wanted me to have something better than my word. The land passed through a small trust, and in 2009, when the title finally cleared, the recorded beneficiary deed transferred Lot 17 to me. I was 24, I drove to the county recorder's office myself, and I filed it myself across the same kind of counter I would later work behind, and I knew exactly what I was holding and exactly how few people ever bother to read one of these things all the way through. I remember the clerk stamping it and handing it back, and I remember thinking that my grandfather had handed me a sentence and that someday I would have to finish it. 2 years later, I took the job in land records. In 2013, I had a modest house built on the lot, in the footprint near where my grandfather's had stood, and I moved in. For a while, the Homeowners Association barely existed, a sleepy thing that collected dues and repainted the clubhouse trim. Then a new board formed, and Dale Ostrander became its president, and the quiet that I had bought with my grandfather's land began, slowly, to be used against me. Now I stood in my empty driveway on a cold March evening, my car somewhere in a tow yard across town, and I heard my grandfather's voice saying they poured that pool in the rain and never reshot a thing. I had filed it away as a story. I was about to turn it into a survey. I went inside and opened my laptop and pulled up the county geographic information system, the same maps I worked in every day, and for the first time in years, I typed in my own parcel number and waited for the lines to load. The parcel loaded the way it always does, a clean polygon outlined in yellow against the aerial photograph. And at first I just looked at it the way you look at a familiar face. Lot 17. My house, small and gray, set back from the road, the driveway, the little square of the back deck. And then I did the thing I do for other people all day long, the thing that no one on the board had ever imagined a homeowner would think to do. I pulled the original recorded plat from 1997, the legal one, the one with my grandfather's carved-out boundary on it, and I laid it over the current aerial as a transparent layer, and I matched the corners, and I looked at where the line ran. The line did not run where the fence ran. The line ran out past the black aluminum fence the board was so proud of. It ran across the pool deck. It cut straight through the middle of the pool, and it carried on past the pool and took in a strip of the clubhouse parking lot before it turned and came back. I sat very still. I have seen people go pale across my counter over a single foot of discrepancy. A foot is a fence dispute. A foot is a lawyer's letter. A foot is a Christmas card 2 neighbors stopped sending. This was not a foot. This was the better part of 20 feet and a swimming pool and the corner of a building. I sat there in the empty office with the heating ticking in the walls and the parking lot lights orange through the blinds, and I felt my heart going hard, and I made myself stop. Because here's the thing about my work that has saved me more than once. I did not trust myself. That is the discipline of the work. You do not trust a screen and a memory and a feeling in your stomach no matter how good you are. A GIS layer is not a survey. An aerial photograph distorts at the edges. A recorded plat can itself contain an error. I had told 100 angry people across my counter that what they were sure they saw on a map was not the same as what a licensed surveyor would find on the ground, and I was not going to make the mistake I had warned them against. You go and you measure. So the next morning, I called Hollis Crane. Hollis is a licensed land surveyor, 55 years old, a man who has spent his whole life standing in other people's yards, being the bearer of expensive news. I knew him the way I knew Teresa, by reputation, by the quality of the work that crossed my desk with his stamp on it. I told him only that I had a boundary question on my own lot, and I wanted it shot properly, corners and all, no shortcuts. He came out on a gray morning in the last week of March. I watched him work from the porch. He set up over the road, and he walked the line, and after a while he crouched down at the very edge of the clubhouse parking lot, where the asphalt met a strip of decorative edging, and he was still for a long time. Then he took out a small tool, and he scraped at the dirt at the asphalt's edge, and he found something, and he looked up the slope toward me with an expression I have learned to read on surveyors. It is not excitement. It is a kind of grim confirmation. "Come look at this," he called. I went down. Sunk in the ground at the very lip of the parking lot, half swallowed by the asphalt they had poured around it, was an iron pin with a worn cap, an original monument, my grandfather's corner. "Whoever built this," Hollis said, tapping the asphalt, "never moved your pin. They didn't even pull it. They just paved up to it and poured over the line and kept going. Your grandfather's monument is right where it's always been. The improvements are the things in the wrong place, not the pin." He said it the way a doctor reads a chart, flatly, without any drama at all, which was the only way I could have heard it. If he had been excited, I think I would have argued with him. Because he was so calm, I had to believe him. A week later, the stamped survey was on my kitchen table. I read the legal description 3 times. I read it the way I read other people's, the way I had been trained, looking for the error, looking for the thing that would make it not true. There was no error. The clubhouse corner, the entire pool, and 19 feet of the parking lot lay inside the recorded boundary of Lot 17. There was no easement on file. There was no lease. There was no recorded agreement of any kind giving the association the right to occupy that ground. For 28 years, the Homeowners Association of Cedar Hollow had collected dues, levied fines, and ruled the street from a clubhouse and a pool that sat, in part, on my land, and not one person in 28 years had checked. I laid the stamped survey on top of the lien at last. The pencil was beside it, and the sentence my grandfather had started for me when I was a girl with my thumb on an iron pin finally finished itself on my own kitchen table. The paper tells you where you are. I want to be honest about the weeks between the survey and what I finally did, because they were the hardest part, and because what happened in them is the reason I am telling this story at all. I did not act right away. I had the survey, I had the leverage, and I sat on it, and the board, sensing that I had stopped paying and stopped flinching, did what boards like that do. They turned up the heat. A new violation notice appeared in my mailbox, this one for a trash bin allegedly left at the curb 3 hours past the approved window. Lonnie Frick took to leaving his business card wedged in my door, a small square of cardstock that said, without saying it, "We are watching you." Word went around the street in the way words go around a street like ours, that I was litigious, that I was difficult, that I was the reason dues might go up. And then I saw what the board did to Pearl Hutchins. Pearl is 81 years old. She has lived in Cedar Hollow longer than I have. 3 doors down, a small woman with a big garden and a way of waving from her porch that had been one of the few warm things about the street. Her son had built her a wheelchair ramp the winter before, a plain, sturdy, well-made ramp because Pearl's hip had finally given out and the 3 steps to her front door had become a wall. I met her at the community mailboxes on a cold afternoon, and she showed me a notice, her hands shaking a little, and the notice was a fine. The ramp was an unapproved exterior modification, not on the approved materials list. The fine was accruing. There was language in it about a lien, about, eventually, foreclosure. They said the ramp wasn't on the approved list, Pearl told me, and she was not angry. She was bewildered, which was worse. I'm 81 years old. I just wanted to be able to get to my own front door. That was the moment it stopped being about my car. I am not a crusader. I want you to understand that about me. I had spent 2 years keeping my head down, paying what I could, telling myself it was the price of the quiet. If it had only ever been about my mailbox and my door, I think I might have found a way to make my own peace and stay small, because staying small is a habit, and the habit was deep in me. But I stood at those mailboxes with Pearl's shaking hands in front of me, and I thought about a board that would put a clock on an 81-year-old woman's house over a ramp to her own door, and something that had been bent in me for 2 years, quietly straightened. I asked Pearl gently whether she had paid anything yet, and she told me she had sent them $200 out of her Social Security the month before because the letter had frightened her, and that she had cut back on something to do it, and she did not say what she had cut back on, but I could guess. Because Pearl is the kind of woman who would skip her own prescription before she would let a letter with the word foreclosure in it go unanswered. I stood there at the cluster of dented metal mailboxes with that picture in my head, an 81-year-old woman choosing between her pills and a fine for the ramp to her own door, and I felt the last of my 2 years of careful smallness burn off like fog. There was a violation hearing that week in the clubhouse, and I went. I sat in a folding chair in a room full of my neighbors, and I watched Dale Ostrander run it like a small court. The clubhouse smelled of new carpet and old coffee. There was a folding table at the front with the board behind it, and a flag in the corner, and a framed photograph of the pool on the wall, the pool sparkling and full in summer, the pool that I now knew sat on my grandfather's ground. People came up one at a time to plead about their fines, a man over a trailer parked one night too long, a young couple over a basketball hoop, and the board listened with the patient, regretful faces of people who have already decided, and then it levied the penalties anyway. Marv Selby, the treasurer, a heavy, tired man of 61, read out penalties from a binder. Dale presided. He had a way of speaking about the community, as if it were a fragile and precious thing that only his vigilance kept from collapse. "We hold the line," he said at one point to the room, "so the whole community doesn't slide. Property values are a shared trust. Some people just refuse to be part of a community." He looked at me when he said the last part. He wanted me to know he was looking at me. I held his eyes and I said nothing, and I thought, you are standing on my grandfather's land to tell me I refuse to be part of a community. I had the survey in the folder in my bag. I could have stood up in that room and ended it in a single sentence. I want you to know that I sat there and felt the whole shape of that sentence in my mouth, and I did not say it. Not because I was afraid. Because I had decided, somewhere between the mailboxes and the folding chair, that I was not going to do this the way Dale did things. I was not going to do it loud, and I was not going to do it as a performance, and I was not going to do it in a way I would have to apologize for later. I was going to do it correctly. That night I went home, and I took Pearl's fine notice, which she had let me copy, and I put it in the same folder as my survey. It had been a folder about me. Now it was a folder about more than one person, and that changed what I owed it. I met Teresa Vogel in her office the following week with the survey, the plat, and the lien laid out on her conference table. She read the survey the way I had read it, slowly, looking for the error. She did not find one either. When she looked up, her expression had changed. Lawyers have a face they make when a case stops being a problem and becomes a position, and Teresa was making it. "Let me make sure I understand what you've brought me," she said. "The lien they recorded against your home for $14,000 was levied by a board that has been operating its clubhouse, its pool, and a chunk of its parking lot on your deeded land without an easement, without a lease, without any recorded right to be there for 28 years. "Yes," I said. She set the survey down. "Maeve, you don't have a defense? People come to me looking for a defense. You have a deed to their pool. The lien is very likely void. The encroachment is real, it's uncured, and it's been sitting there generating what a court would call a continuing trespass since before half these houses were built. If you wanted to, you could file a quiet title action. You could sue for the value of their use of your land going back years. You could make this very loud and very expensive for a lot of people. And if I don't want to do it that way?" She looked at me for a moment. "Then the question becomes what kind of person you want to be while you're holding all of this. Because right now you're holding a great deal." "There's one more thing you should understand," Teresa said before I left. "A continuing trespass like this, on residential land with no recorded easement, in some circumstances entitles you to back rent for the years of use and to have the encroaching structures removed at the association's expense. I am not telling you to ask for that. I am telling you that it is on the table so that whatever you decide to ask for instead, you decide it knowing what you're setting down. People feel weak when they give things up. You are not weak here. You would be choosing." I had already decided, but it helped to hear her lay out the loud path so I could be sure I was turning it down on purpose. I did not want a courtroom. I did not want years. I did not want to be the woman who drained the neighborhood's pool out of spite, because that woman would have proven Dale right about me in the only way that mattered, by becoming someone who used power the way he used it. I had watched, across my counter, what the loud path does to people. They win sometimes, and the winning hollows them out, and they spend the rest of their lives defending a line on a map instead of living on the land it encloses. My grandfather had not kept that corner so that I could turn it into a weapon. He had kept it so I would have a place to stand. What I wanted was simpler and stranger. I wanted them to have to read the land. I wanted the fact to stand up in the open, in daylight, where the whole street would have to look at it, and I wanted them to come to me. So I chose the narrowest, most exact move I could make. I drove to the county permit desk, the public one, the same kind of counter I sit behind, and I pulled a permit. Not for a lawsuit, for a fence. A fence along the surveyed boundary of my own recorded lot, built lawfully with a posted permit by a licensed crew. Everything I was about to do, I would do with a permit and a property line. That was the whole point. I was not going to become Dale Ostrander to beat Dale Ostrander. On my way home, I stopped at Pearl's. I told her, without going into all of it, that I was going to make the board read the land, and that the ramp was going to be all right. She did not fully understand, and I did not need her to. "I'm not going to drain their pool, Pearl," I said, mostly to myself. "I'm going to make them ask me for it." That night, I ordered the fence, and I circled a Saturday on the calendar, the morning the post would go in, and I slept better than I had in 2 years. The crew came on a bright Saturday morning in the middle of April, the first really warm day of the year, and they posted the permit on a stake at the road the way the law requires. And they began to set a fence along the surveyed line. I had given them the survey. I had walked the line with the foreman and shown him the pins, including my grandfather's old monument at the lip of the parking lot. And he had flagged the corners, and now his crew was augering post holes straight down the boundary of Lot 17. The line ran where it had always run, where the paper said it ran. It ran across the pool deck. It ran through the gate of the black aluminum fence the board loved. It took in 19 feet of the parking lot. By mid-morning, there were steel posts standing in concrete across the entrance to the community pool, and a temporary construction fence strung between them, and the pool that the board had ruled the street with for 28 years sat behind it, drained and gray and very clearly now, on the wrong side of a line. It is a strange thing to watch a true sentence be built out of steel and concrete, one post hole at a time. The auger bit into the dirt, and the crew dropped the posts and poured the quick-setting mix, and with every post, the line my grandfather had walked with me when I was a girl became a little more undeniable, a little more impossible to argue with, a thing you could lean your hand against. I stood on my porch with my coffee, a warm cup this time, and I watched the fence say out loud what the paper had been saying quietly in a drawer at the county for 28 years. Neighbors gathered the way neighbors do. By 11, there were a dozen people standing on the grass, talking low, looking from the post to the pool to me. Children drifted over on bicycles. Somebody's dog. The ordinary Saturday business of the street collected itself around a thing it did not understand yet. And then Dale Ostrander's clean German sedan came around the corner, fast, too fast for our posted speed limit, which I noticed with a small private flicker in Lonnie Frick's truck behind it, and Dale was out of the car almost before it stopped. "What do you think you're doing?" His voice was high and tight. "You can't fence off the community pool." I had been waiting on my own grass with a folder under my arm. I did not raise my voice. I have learned that if you stay quiet, people have to stop shouting eventually just to hear what you are saying, and the silence does work that shouting never can. I handed him the survey and the posted permit. "It isn't the community's pool, Dale," I said. "It never was. It's on my land. It's been on my land since before the pool existed. There's no easement. There's no lease. There's nothing on file that gives the association the right to be there. Read the corners. He looked at the survey. I do not think he could read it. Not really, not the way I read it, but you do not have to be able to read a survey to understand a survey that a crowd of your neighbors is now reading over your shoulder. The stamped map went hand to hand across the grass, and it was Wes Tamblin who found it. Wes is a neighbor of mine, 52, a plain and decent man who had served on the board's committees and signed his name to things he had not looked at closely, the way busy people do. He crouched at the edge of the parking lot where Hollis Crane had crouched, and he scraped at the dirt, and he found my grandfather's pin sunk in the asphalt with its worn iron cap, and he stood up slowly with a look on his face I will not forget. That's an original monument, Wes said, loud enough for everyone. Dale, this is a 1971 pin. This is her grandfather's land. We've been swimming in her backyard for 20 years. The grass went quiet. A dozen people looked at the pool and the posts and the stamped map, and you could watch the thing settle over them, the way understanding settles over a crowd all at once, like a change in the wind. Dale stood there with the survey in his hands. He reached, I could see him reaching, for the old certainties, for a citation, for a clause, for the tone of voice that had always worked. For the first time since I had known him, there was nothing there. He had built his whole authority on knowing the rules better than anyone, and he had just learned, in front of his neighbors, that he had never read the most important one. This has to be a mistake, he said. The developer, the plat, this is recorded. The pool is recorded as a common amenity. The pool is recorded as sitting where they built it, I said. They built it on my line. Recording a mistake doesn't make it true, Dale. It just makes it findable. You did this on purpose, Dale said to me quietly, almost wonderingly, the survey still in his hands. All this time, you knew. I learned it 3 weeks ago, I told him. The same way you could have learned it any day in 28 years. It was always in the drawer, Dale. You just never thought you needed to look because you'd already decided what kind of person I was. That's the whole story. You were so sure you had me figured that you never read the ground you were standing on to tell me I didn't belong on it. He had no answer. There was no citation for it. And Lonnie Frick, who had spent 2 years leaving cards in my door, would not meet my eyes any more than the tow operator had. And I understood then that the people who do this kind of work for men like Dale always know, somewhere, exactly what they are doing. I went inside after that. I did not stay to watch him. There is a temptation, in a moment like that, to stand and feel it, to drink it. And I knew that if I drank it, I would become someone I did not want to be. So I left him on the grass, with the survey and the pin, and 28 years of arithmetic that had just come out wrong, and I closed my door, the door whose color had its own line item, and I let the post say the only thing that needed saying. Behind the chain link, the pool sat silent and blue-gray under its tarp, and the whole street stood on the wrong side of a line they had never known was there. The board's first instinct was the only one it had. It tried to win. There was a special meeting called within the week, posted on the clubhouse door, regarding the unauthorized obstruction of common amenities. I went, with Teresa beside me. The clubhouse was full. People who had never come to a meeting in their lives came to this one, because by then the survey had been loose in the neighborhood for days, passed around at mailboxes and over fences and in the school pickup line, and everyone wanted to see what would happen. Dale ran the meeting from the front, but something had gone out of him. He had a proposal. He laid it out in the reasonable, magnanimous voice of a man who believes he's offering a gift. The board, he said, is prepared to be generous here. We all want to put this unpleasantness behind us. We're prepared to void the lien against Ms. Donnelly's property, in full, and to waive the outstanding fines, in exchange for Ms. Donnelly removing the obstruction and signing a permanent easement, granting the association continued use of the amenity area. We think that's more than fair. We think that's the community coming together. He actually smiled when he said it. Void the lien, waive the fines, in exchange for the land. He was offering to forgive a debt he had no right to collect in return for a deed to ground he had occupied without permission for 28 years, and he had managed to convince himself it was charity. Teresa stood up. She did not raise her voice either. She did not need to. Let me make sure everyone in this room understands what's being offered, she said. The board is proposing to forgive a lien it had no legal standing to record, in exchange for a permanent easement over land it has occupied for 28 years without any recorded right whatsoever. In other words, the board would like Ms. Donnelly to give it for free and forever, the very thing it has spent 2 years fining her for living next to. We'll pass. And then the room turned. That was the part Dale had not planned for, because once Teresa said it plainly, the neighbors started doing their own arithmetic, out loud. Wes Tamblyn stood up with a folder of his own. "I pulled my fine history," he said. "I've paid this board $1,100 in fines over 4 years. For a basketball hoop. For a recycling bin. I want to know how much of that went to maintain a pool that turns out to be sitting on Maeve Donnelly's land." A woman near the back said she wanted to know the same thing. Someone asked how much the association had spent, in dues, resurfacing a parking lot that was 19 feet too long. Someone else asked very quietly about Pearl Hutchins and the ramp. Once people saw the line, I would say later, they couldn't unsee what they'd been paying to defend. The machine the board had built to punish people turned, in that meeting, on the people who had built it. It was not me doing it. I sat in my folding chair with Teresa, and I said almost nothing. It was the neighbors, looking at the survey and then at their own canceled checks. And you cannot unring that. Dale tried, in the last minutes of that meeting, to do the thing that had always worked for him. He raised his voice. He talked about obligations and shared trust and the slippery slope of letting one homeowner hold the community hostage. And he had Lonnie Frick hand around a hastily printed flyer with my name on it. A flyer that called me, in bold letters, a threat to property values and to the safety of the neighborhood's children, because the pool was closed, and whose fault was that? For 2 years that move had been enough. A raised voice, a printed accusation, the word children. It had cowed the whole street. It did not work, and you could feel the exact moment it stopped working. A woman 2 rows ahead of me, someone I had never spoken to, turned the flyer over in her hands and said, not loudly, "Dale, the pool's closed because you built it on her land. You're handing me a flyer about her children when you put a foreclosure clock on Pearl Hutchins." And that was all. One ordinary sentence from one ordinary neighbor, and the spell that had run Cedar Hollow for years simply broke, the way a fever breaks. Within 10 days, there was a recall petition. Wes carried it himself, door to door, to remove Dale Ostrander as president and Marv Selby as treasurer, and to seat an interim board. He came to my door with it, and I will always remember what he said, because it was the most honest thing anyone in Cedar Hollow had said to me in 2 years. "I'm not doing this for you, Maeve," Wes said, standing on my step with the clipboard. "I want to be straight about that. I'm doing it because I sat on that committee, and I helped him fine an 81-year-old woman over a ramp to her own front door. And I never once asked to see the map. I'm doing it because I should be able to look Pearl in the eye." The recall notice went up on the clubhouse door, on the same corkboard where my violation notices used to hang, where Pearl's notice had hung. I walked past it on a warm evening, and I read it twice, and I thought about how a thing can hang in the same place and mean the opposite of what it used to mean. I should tell you about the evenings during all of this, because that is where the real story lived, the part that was never about the pool. There is a cost to being right that nobody warns you about. Being right did not give me back the 2 years. The survey proved my case, but it did not unhappen the mornings I had walked to my own car, wondering what they would find wrong with me that day, or the way I had started to flinch at the sound of a notice sliding under the door, or the slow erosion of feeling in my own grandfather's house, like a guest who was on probation. A stamped map cannot reach back and fix that. I had to sit with it. And there was something else I had to sit with, and I want to be honest about it because it is the part I am least proud of and the part that mattered most. With that fence up, I had power. Real power. I could have kept that fence up forever. The land would have let me. I could have made the board lease the pool back from me at whatever number I named, or never at all. I could have let the chlorine turn green and watched them stew, summer after summer, and every law in the county would have been on my side. I stood at that chain link one evening at dusk, in the long gold light, on land that was provably and completely mine, and I felt how good it would feel to keep it locked. And I understood, for the first time, exactly how Dale Ostrander had become Dale Ostrander. It is not hard. You just decide that being right entitles you to be cruel. And then you are. I did not want to be a person who needed that. I want to be careful how I say this, because it is not about being a saint. I am not a saint. It is about the fact that I had a grandfather who taught me to read the land so I would always know where I stood. And he did not teach me that so I could use it to put a clock on somebody's house. I thought a great deal, in those evenings, about how a person becomes the thing they hate. I do not believe Dale Ostrander started out cruel. I think he started out wanting his street to be nice, the way most of us do. And somewhere along the way, being right about the rules became the same thing in his mind as being good. And once those two things fuse, you can do almost anything to almost anyone and still feel righteous doing it. You can find an old woman over a ramp and call it stewardship. I had felt, standing at the chain link, the first warm pull of exactly that fusion in myself. the sense that because the land was mine, I was therefore entitled to whatever I chose to do with it to whoever had wronged me. And I understood that the only thing that had ever really stood between me and becoming Dale was not my innocence. It was a choice I had to keep making. What clarified it was Pearl. I had coffee with her on her porch, the porch with the ramp the board had threatened her over, and she put her small hand on my arm and she said, "You know what you did, dear? You didn't just save your driveway. You let me keep my front door." And I realized that was the whole thing. That was worth more to me than 19 feet of asphalt or the satisfaction of a pool full of green water. The board had been about to take an old woman's home over a ramp, and now they were not, and that was the win. The pool was never the win. The pool was just the lever. That night, I took out my grandfather's pencil again, and I set the stamped survey beside it on the kitchen table. The two of them together, the sentence finished. He had told me to learn the paper. He had never told me that the paper could hand you a whole neighborhood back, or that it could show you very clearly which neighborhood was worth keeping and which version of yourself you wanted to be holding it. I turned off the porch light over a street that was finally, genuinely quiet. Not the bought quiet the board sold, but a real one. And for the first time in a long time, the quiet felt like it belonged to me. The recall passed in the second week of May. Dale Ostrander and Marv Selby were voted off the board by a margin that was not close, and an interim board was seated with West Hamblin at the head of it. And the whole tenor of the street changed almost overnight, the way weather changes. The new board did the thing the developer should have done in 1998. It read the land, and then it dealt with it honestly. Teresa and I sat down with Wes and the interim board, and instead of a fight, there was, at last, a negotiation between adults. The association would record a proper easement and a fair lease for the ground under the clubhouse corner, the pool, and the 19 feet of parking lot, at a value Hollis Crane and an independent appraiser set together, paid out of dues going forward. In exchange, the encroachment was cured, on paper, the way it should have been from the start. My lien was voided and removed from my title. Every fine the old board had levied against me, the mailbox, the fence stain, the door, all of it was dissolved. The tow was reversed and the fee refunded, and Pearl Hutchins's ramp was approved retroactively, her fine erased with a written apology that Wes insisted on signing himself. "We're paying you what the land is worth, Maeve," Wes said at the signing, sliding the agreement across the table. "We should have done it the year they poured the concrete." There was a moment in that meeting I keep. The new board had brought the old binder, the one Marv used to read penalties from, and Wes set it on the table and asked me, plainly, whether I wanted any of the people who had sat on the old committees, named in the record, held to account, written down. He was offering me a list. I looked at it for a while, then I told him to close the binder. I had not done any of this to make a new list of people who lay awake at night. I had done it so that one old woman could keep her front door, and so that the ground would finally say, in writing, what it had always been. A list would only have started the whole machine again, pointed the other way. I almost told him I did not want the money, and it was true, I did not. But I had learned something across my own counter over 15 years, watching people try to be generous with land. I let them pay, not because I wanted the money, but because the payment was the proof. A handshake forgets. A recorded lease, signed and filed, means that for as long as that pool exists, the association will know, in writing, whose ground it stands on. The check was never the point. The check was just how I made sure they would always have to know. The morning the agreement recorded, I went out and I took the fence down myself. I did not have the crew do it. I wanted to do it. It was a warm Saturday again, much like the one in April, and there were kids already waiting at the pool gate with towels over their shoulders because word had gone around that the pool was opening, and I pulled the posts out of the ground one by one and stacked them on a trailer, and when the gate was clear, I held it open and the kids went through. I opened the gate I had every legal right to keep locked forever, and that was the only sentence I ever needed to say to the whole street. I did not give a speech. I never gave a speech, not once in the whole thing. I just opened a gate. I heard later that Dale and Connie Ostrander put their house up for sale at the end of that summer and moved to another town. I did not celebrate it. I had no quarrel left with him by then. A man who has run a small kingdom on the certainty that he is the only thing standing between order and ruin cannot easily go on living in a place that has seen the kingdom was built on someone else's lawn. I understood it, and I let it be. Marv Selby stayed, chastened, and to his credit, served quietly on a committee under the new board and never made trouble again. People are not all one thing. That is something the work teaches you too. A few days later, Pearl's new notice went up where the old one had been, except this one said her ramp was approved and her fine refunded, and she came down her ramp to her own front gate to tell me about it, walking carefully, on her own, to her own door. She had a plate of lemon bars wrapped in a paper towel, and she pressed it into my hands the way older women do, as though sugar were a kind of deed of its own, a recorded promise of welcome, and in a way I suppose it was. "Will you sit with me on the porch this summer?" she asked. "Every week," I told her, and I have. The pool reopened under an honest agreement, and that summer for the first time I could hear the noise of it from my kitchen window, the splashing and the shouting and the lifeguard's whistle, and it did not sound like something I was outside of anymore. It sounded like something I was finally a part of, on land I had never had to ask anyone's permission to stand on. I want to talk to you for a moment, you specifically, if you have ever had someone decide where you belong. Maybe it was a board with a clipboard. Maybe it was a family, or a boss, or an in-law, or just a louder voice in a room that was sure it had you figured out. Here's what I learned standing in an empty driveway in my robe on a cold March morning, watching my own car get towed off my own concrete. They almost never checked. The people who are most certain about exactly where you belong are almost always the ones who never bothered to read the map. They were so sure of their arithmetic that it never occurred to them to go back and look at the figures. Dale Ostrander ran an entire neighborhood from a pool he didn't own, and he was certain, right up until the morning he wasn't, because being certain had always been enough. So learn the map. Whatever your map is, the deed, the record, the truth of where you actually stand, learn it, and keep it somewhere you can reach it. You do not have to be the loudest person in the room. I never once raised my voice in this whole story, and I won every part of it that was worth winning because quiet, exact, provable truth outlasts every confident voice that was too lazy to check. Stay quiet if quiet is who you are. Stay kind if you can, and you can more often than you think, because kindness on solid ground is a strength and not a surrender, and keep the one true thing where you can reach it. The day someone decides you are nothing is very often the day they find out whose land they have been standing on the whole time. Thank you for sitting with me a while. Take care of yourself out there, and mind your corners.